Tonight, I would like to welcome Adam Kautza from the Coldwater Fisheries Project Leader from Massachusetts Fish and Wildlife. And I heard part of this presentation before. I found it really, really interesting to think about the work that Mass Fish and Wildlife and Adam has done to study these over 1,200 streams in Massachusetts, and I was surprised at the outcome. And I think we all know Adam well. We've seen him at chapter meetings before. Our former president, Bill Pishusik, in 2018 presented Adam with the Conservation Advocate Award for all the work that he's done, not just with our chapter, but with the Deerfield chapter, with Neponset, and with the Mass Council. He's been a real advocate of government crossing the bridge and shaking hands with nonprofits and other organizations to help preserve our coldwater fisheries. So thank you, Adam. With that, I'm going to let you take the screen, and if you have questions, we'll monitor the chat, but if there's something you really got to shout out there, I think Adam's open to taking them or deflecting them as appropriate.
All right, so thanks for having me. My name is Adam Kautza, Coldwater Fisheries Project Leader for Mass Wildlife. And as Rui said, he had come to the board meeting in August and saw a presentation that's going to be very similar to this, and asked me to come in, and thought that this would be information that you all would enjoy hearing. So thank you, Rui, for having me come in. It's been a couple of years, maybe 3 years since I've been to the GBTU meeting and gave a presentation. So it's nice to be back. So what I'm going to be talking about today is, it's sort of a long title, but basically I'm going to be going through a piece of a broader wild trout management plan that we've been working on for the state of Massachusetts. And this is a really important component of that. It's a wild trout stream classification system. And hopefully that will make more sense as we go through. But just to sort of put it out there ahead of time, this is not sort of the final end version of what this is going to be. It's likely going to be very similar, if not the same, but there may be some tweaking after we have some internal discussions. So whatever I present today, sort of take it with a small grain of salt. Don't kind of just take it and run with it, because it may look slightly different. This is essentially, sort of a beta version of what it's going to end up being. But, it's something we've been working on for a while, and I think that it's something that is very important for not only for our anglers, but also for conservation and obviously for management of our wild trout resources. And as Rui said, I'm happy to take questions as we go along or save them to the end, whatever you guys want to do. Okay, so let's get started. Sorry, it's not working again. It's okay, now here we go. All right, sorry there's so many problems to get started here, but anyway, okay, so wild trout stream classification system. Basically, when we started this process, we started to think about, how do we, classify our wild trout stream. So right now, as it is, there's a very broad scale classification. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this designation of a coldwater fish resource. Basically what this is this every coldwater fishery in the state is designated as a coldwater fish resource. It's a very broad classification. And at Mass Wildlife, we define it as a water body that contains coldwater fish. And you can see all of the coldwater fish species listed here along the bottom, including brook, brown, and rainbow trout, which we're going to be focusing on for most of this presentation. So a water body that contains coldwater fish that reproduced in that water body or a tributary thereto and use such waters to meet one or more of their life history requirements. So this is our standard definition of what a coldwater fish resource is. And I'll touch on it again later, but basically what it means is that when we do a survey on a stream and we find a coldwater fish, even if it's one of any of these species, As long as it was reproduced in that water body, so this doesn't count for hatchery fish. As long as it was reproduced in that water body, we can use that information to classify that stream as a CFR. So that's important because once it's classified as a CFR, it gets additional protection above and beyond what a normal stream would get. So CFRs are included in the revisions to the Water Management Act. And this is aimed at helping to minimize and optimize water withdrawals in watersheds that have CFRs. CFRs are also referenced in surface water quality standards. They're protected under things like the anti-degradation clause, meaning that when you're dealing with a CFR, extra protections kick in relation to stormwater management, what sort of activities can go on in the riparian area, et cetera, et cetera. So, I'm not going to get into too much detail with this, just because on a day-to-day basis as a biologist, I tend not to work too closely with some of these regulations and things like that. And it's also not all that exciting to talk about. But if you guys are interested in some of the nuances of this, feel free to reach out to me at some point, email or whatever, and we can go into more detail. I just don't think that I'm going to talk about it too much right now. You can also find all this stuff and read to your heart's content online. All these statutes, all these regulations, all this stuff is available on our website if you're interested in that sort of thing. But big picture, classification as a CFR affords that stream and its resource greater protection. So, as I said, this is a really broad classification. Basically, the only criteria is presence of cold water fish. So, it's not super meaningful, on a finer scale, especially when we think about, the resource as anglers, or even when we start to think about the resource as, conservation organizations or other folks who are interested in conservation and restoration. So we started to think about, well, if we look at it from these other perspectives, how do we sort of narrow down this very broad scale classification into something more meaningful? So how do we make this wild trout specific? Because you remember, the cold water fish is a whole group of species, not just trout. How do we make that more useful and meaningful for anglers? So as it is, you have a map and a list of CFRs, but it doesn't give you any really information beyond that, where they are and that they are a CFR. So how do we make this more useful and meaningful for anglers? And then how do we make this, more useful for people who are interested in conservation, who have, maybe for targeting land acquisition, things like this. So I think we can do a lot more, at a finer scale than the sort of CFR designation. So, really the first step then is to take all of our data, our extensive database of fisheries data, and highlight those CFRs that support wild trout. And well, it turns out that almost all of them do. So you can see the map here. These are all CFRs that support naturally reproducing populations of wild trout. So of the 1,265 currently designated CFRs, nearly all of them, 1,255, support wild trout. And you see that they're spread all across the state, from greater Boston metro area, Martha's Vineyard, Cape Cod, and then when you start to get kind of Worcester and west, there's really quite a few of them. So drilling down a little bit further, we can start to look at, well, what do we have current data on? So of these 1,255 wild trout streams, 1,187 of them have current fish data. So we decided to break this out, sort of current fish data and historic fish data, right around the year 2000. And we can argue, whether we can consider 20-year-old fish data necessarily current. But 2000 is a good break point because that's about the time that we really started to standardize our official stream survey protocol. And that's also the time when we really started to systematically go out and make an effort to survey each and every one of the cold water fisheries in the state. So it's a good sort of breaking point. And since 2000, we've been able to survey 1,187 wild trout streams. Of those, a very high proportion consist of wild brook trout. 1,160 of the 1,187 have wild brook trout in them. And of those, the vast majority are brook trout only. So, it might be brook trout and other non-salmonid species, black-nosed dace, long-nosed dace, white sucker, what have you, but they don't share the habitat with other trout species. We do have a fair number of wild brown trout streams in the state as well, 193. Most of these wild brown trout streams are sort of dual species. They're brown trout and brook trout. We only have about a couple dozen streams with only brown trout and associated non-salmonid species. So not super common. And we do have a small handful of wild rainbow trout streams. All of these wild rainbow trout streams also share their habitat with brook trout. And so that leaves behind 68 streams of these 1,255 wild trout streams where we have historic records of wild trout, but we don't have updated survey data to be able to sort of confirm or disconfirm whether or not they're still wild trout streams. So these are streams that need updated survey data. All right, so we've kind of narrowed it down a bit. We've got the CFR designation. Now we have a better idea of, how many of these have wild trout, how many have the different species of wild trout, and where we might need to fill in some data gaps to survey all of these streams. So the next step then is really the part that I was interested in, and the part that I think is going to be most meaningful moving forward for anglers and conservation and organizations and things like that, is to then classify these existing wild trout streams into discrete categories. So, other agencies do this. It's a pretty common way to categorize streams for management purposes and things like that. So, you look around the Northeast, several states do it. You look across the country and a lot of states do this. But the thing is, when we started to do some research and think about, well, how do we want to classify our wild trout streams? What metric might be the most meaningful, might be the best way to do it? We find that most agencies do it differently. So some use biomass of trout per acre, some use biomass per hectare, some use number of individuals in different age classes, some use number of trout per mile, some use number of trout above a certain size class per mile. So there's really no consensus on what is the best or most meaningful metric for classifying wild trout streams. So, we started looking at, well, what kind of data do we have? What do we want to use as a metric for classification? And so we thought abundance, is really the most meaningful. We have the most abundance data. We do have biomass data, but it's not nearly as ubiquitous as our abundance data. So we have abundance data for everything. We don't necessarily have biomass data for everything. And so that was one reason. And also, I feel like we were really more interested in abundance and telling the story of trout abundance and classifying that rather than classifying biomass. So we chose number of trout per kilometer of stream, and this extrapolated out from our standard electrofishing survey data. So our standard electrofishing surveys are 100 meters in length, but we decided to extrapolate that out to the kilometer, partly because it's just easier to communicate and visualize, 500 trout per kilometer than it is to say, 50 trout per 100 meters or 0.5 trout per meter. So that was one reason. And also, we felt like breaking into the 100-meter reaches or even finer, make everything too granular, we wouldn't necessarily be able to come up with any sort of broader scale management or things like that. Whereas if we looked at it in sort of bigger chunks, it'd be a little bit more manageable. And so, we can debate on the merits of this, if a kilometer is really, the best representation, because, you may have shifts in habitat and water quality across the course of that kilometer. But, at this point, it's sort of, the best of both worlds, for a number of reasons. And so, we decided to do number of trout per kilometer as our basis for classification.
Adam, I had a question.
Yes.
If you're looking at 100-meter stretches and different stretches and getting different counts, are you then taking a stream and classifying it on the basis of the average?
Yeah, so if we have multiple surveys from the same stream, then we're certainly averaging them. And so I'll get to a little bit more detail on that. But for sure, if the stream is, there's multiple surveys, we average them. A lot of streams, especially in Massachusetts, where we have a lot of small headwater streams or wild trout streams, a lot of them aren't even a kilometer long. So it's pretty easy to sort of, extrapolate out from one survey reach. On bigger streams, we may have surveys in multiple parts of the stream, but as you'll see here on this last bullet point, our classifications are based on percentiles relative to things like stream order. So, stream order is sort of a classification system in and of itself, but it's really a surrogate for stream size and longitudinal position in the landscape. So if you're not familiar with stream order, it's just a numbering system for streams based on where they are in the watershed. So if you take two first order streams are headwaters, they're high in the watershed, they have few, if any, tributaries. If you take two first order streams and they come together, that's a second order stream. Two second order streams come together, that's a third order stream, and so on and so forth. So, this may be sort of a long-winded answer, but so if we have surveys in different stream orders on the same stream, we'll average those together, but we're not comparing a fourth order stream to a third order stream. We're breaking that out in the classification system. So we're comparing sort of apples to apples rather than, a big stream lower in the watershed to a small stream higher in the watershed. Does that make sense? Okay, so, it's going to be relative to stream order, and it's also going to be relative to trout species present. So, the classification system is going to be based on, whether it's a brook trout stream, a brown trout stream, or a mixed species stream, because, in general, we find abundance much higher among brook trout than we do brown trout wherever they're found. So we didn't want to compare, abundance, of trout just as a blanket statement, because they're not really comparable. So maybe this will help if we run through an example, but let me just mention ahead of time. So we broke these out into bins of percentiles, and we gave each of them sort of a letter designation. I'm also using some descriptive terms. These are kind of placeholders. Terminology is important. So we're not fully decided on what we're going to call these. We may not call them anything beyond class A, B, C, D, etc. So these are just placeholders at this time. But essentially what we did is we took all of our trout data and calculated percentiles for abundance for each of the trout species by stream order. So you can see here in this table, a class A stream with brook trout, first order, anything with 945 brook trout per kilometer and above fits into this class A designation. And then you can see the rest of the bins broken out like that. So, you know, if we go out and do a survey and say we find, you know, we look at our GIS maps, it's a second order stream. We go out and do a survey and we find 80 brook trout in a 100-meter stretch, no other trout species. We go to our table and we see that compared to other streams in the state of the second order with brook trout only, 80 brook trout in a 100-meter stretch, 800 brook trout in a kilometer, it fits squarely in this Class B designation. So does that make sense to everybody, that example that I've run through? Okay. So there are additional classes for wild trout streams. So not everything fits into these bins for a variety of reasons, you know, and most of that has to do with, you know, missing or incomplete data. So we do have streams where we can only classify the trout as present. For whatever reason, reach length data was not recorded. And while our standard surveys are 100 meters, there's some cases where we do a little bit less or we do a little bit more. And so we can't just assume that every stream that doesn't have reach length data is 100 meters. So we can't necessarily calculate abundance for that sample. So we can only say that they're present and then, you know, follow up and go back to these and resurvey them at some point. There's also a classification for absent. These are streams where we have historic data of wild trout being present in the system, but we've resurveyed them since 2000, and we're unable to turn up any wild trout. That doesn't mean they're completely extirpated. It just means that they're absent from our surveys, and so we can't necessarily, you know, put them into a letter classification. And then we have a classification for unknown. So this is streams, these are streams with historic data of wild trout, but no updated survey data. So we haven't been able to get back to these streams. So these are that 68 streams that I mentioned before that we haven't gotten back to yet. This also includes, you know, sections of streams with no surveys. So we may have, you know, if we think of a long stream, we may have a survey way up top and in the bottom, near the bottom, but nothing in the middle. So we can block this middle part out and say, well, we can't necessarily classify this section because we don't have a survey. We can't necessarily extrapolate out because the upper part and the lower part are too different. This also is the same for if there's an impenetrable barrier. So like a dam or something like that. If we have a survey above it or below it, but not vice versa, the section that's unsurveyed is unknown. And so we'd have to, you know, to highlight and target some of these for updated surveys. So does anybody, I guess that's a lot of information in a couple of slides. Does anybody have any questions?
It's some good details in there, Adam. I think there's one relevant question to the stream order. Why do second order streams appear to have higher numbers than first order streams?
That's just the way it broke out. You know, in some cases, first order streams are these very small headwater streams. They don't necessarily offer up the best habitat. Mm-hmm. You know, they're smaller, they're usually higher gradient. And, you know, second order streams, you start to get a little bit better habitat, little bit lower gradient in some cases. They're a little bit bigger, and there's just, you know, more space, more resources, and you tend to see this bump in abundance, especially for brook trout. You know, it's even more pronounced for, if I were to put the table up for brown trout, it's even more pronounced in like the third and fourth order streams because brown trout tend to do better in some of these larger, warmer reaches relative to brook trout. So that's why you see that jump there from first to second order.
Okay. And a couple other quick questions. The rainbow trout do seem to have some interest. One is, do the rainbow trout, what part of the state are they in? I don't know if we're not attempting to spot burn anything here and say, here's the perfect spot. And also, trout do migrate from up and down the stream, or maybe even to different streams during the year, right?
So yeah, they do migrate. Well, let me answer the other one first. I won't say exactly because I'm not sure how sensitive folks are with giving away that information. It's somewhere in Western Massachusetts. So, but if the people who do know about it and they're comfortable giving the information away, feel free to do it. I'm just not going to do it because I don't want to get in trouble for that. But yeah, so trout, they do migrate. It's sort of all over the map, depending on where you are. Brook trout are notorious for not migrating that far in most instances. There are some cases where they do migrate a long distance, and that's generally in sort of larger river systems where they, have the ability to access the main stem and the tributaries. We don't really see that often in Massachusetts just because, most of the larger main stems are not suitable habitat for brook trout. So they do migrate, but it's not generally going to be, at least, to my mind in Massachusetts, it's not going to be super long distances. Rainbow trout, brown trout, slightly different story. Brown trout, are often thought of to be homebodies, but they do migrate for spawning and things like that. Rainbow trout are sort of all over the place. They tend to move quite a bit. But yeah, there's always that possibility that what we're surveying in our one survey may look different at different times of the year, but it's the best sort of information we've got.
Thank you.
Are you guys ready to move on then? Okay. All right. So you don't have to take all this in. Obviously, it's a little bit busy, but this gives you sort of a general idea of what we might be able to provide as far as products go when we start to use this classification system to sort of push out for anglers or for conservation organizations and things like that. You can start to look at where do we find class A, B, C, and D streams. We can use it internally for targeting updated surveys. So where do we find streams where we only have presence data, but we need to go back and get more information? We can look at streams that used to have wild trout and no longer, at least in our surveys, they seem to be absent. We can use this map and information in a lot of different ways, for informing anglers, for informing, where we want to pinpoint conservation, where we want to pinpoint restoration, and all sorts of different things. And so this is just one sort of broad overview, but it's something that, and I see here now that I'm looking at it, I left off the unknown classification on here, but for whatever reason, we can do a lot with this. And this is sort of just to give you an idea of what things might look like. Okay, so before we move on, I just want to sort of recap quick. We started with this broad classification of CFRs, narrowed that down to wild trout specific, looked at different species of wild trout, and then used that information to classify and categorize all of our wild trout streams based on abundance and other data that we have. And I'll get at the very end, I'll talk a little bit more detail about sort of uses of this classification system. But we also have sort of a special classification that we've worked on. And again, as far as terminology goes, this is kind of a placeholder, but right now, I'm terming these sort of quote unquote premier wild trout fisheries. And so this is going to be a special classification for highlighting and promoting really our best of the best wild trout fisheries, specifically to anglers. And there's a few criteria that we've determined that needed to be met to sort of belong to this special group of premier wild trout fisheries. One of that being, high abundance, whether it's class A or class B for total trout abundance. And then beyond that, some sort of size structure criteria. So we needed these to meet greater than median abundance of larger individuals. And we talk about larger individuals in wild trout streams. We're talking, not larger individuals when you think about, giant fish, but, anything 6 inches or above for brook trout, which is a fully mature fish in most instances, and anything 8 inches or above for brown trout. So, the size structure criteria, and then, a few physical characteristics of the stream and the location itself. So, stream size, width conducive to angling. So anything about 10 meters and wider, there's obviously streams out there that meet the first two criteria. They high abundance, presence of larger individuals, but, it might be a foot wide, and full of, vegetation. And, it's not really something that we're going to necessarily promote as, a quote unquote premier fishery if most people aren't really going to want to fish it. So something that's, more, akin to something you'd want to go and fish. So roughly 10 meters wide, or 10 feet wide or wider. And then we also want to make sure there's parking available, and public access, whether it's through public land, an easement, or through unposted private land. These streams need to be accessible to be able to be considered, sort of a premier wild trout fishery. So initially, we scoured the database and came up with 112 streams that met the abundance criteria, the size structure criteria, and the stream width criteria. So we had to go back to all of these and resurvey them to make sure that they still met these criteria, and also to investigate whether or not there was parking available, whether there was public access. And so we've identified 45 to date that, based on recent surveys and field investigation, meet the criteria, all of the criteria for inclusion in this, what we're terming at the moment premier wild trout fisheries. We still have 31 additional streams to get to, but by the end of this, hopefully after next year, we'll have the full list and we can move forward with that. But we should have somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 65 premier wild trout fisheries, sort of scattered across the state. Obviously there's a few more in the western half of the state, but we will hopefully have some in most parts of the state. But this is going to be important for a lot of different reasons. And I think that some of the uses of the stream classification system, really first and foremost, and I've kind of made that a point here during this presentation, is to really promote angling for wild trout and to inform anglers on places to go and what to expect. I realize that there's some pushback from folks that don't necessarily want to give up secret spots, or people feel that anglers need to go out and do the research themselves, and those are valid arguments. But the thing is, that a lot of people have limited time to fish, and there's just a lot of people aren't really going to spend their one day off to go bushwhack to a stream that may or may not have what they're looking for. They're just going to go to the Swift, or they're going to go to a stocked trout fishery nearby, or they're going to go to the Deerfield or something, which are all great fisheries, obviously. But sometimes especially with those of you who fish the Swift, they can get a little crowded. And so I think having the ability to share this information and have 65 premier wild trout fisheries, several hundred Class A streams, or any sort of designation that you want, to be able to sort of pick and choose and go to these different places and catch wild fish, may take some of the pressure off some of these fisheries, and also give people a greater appreciation of the diversity and the distribution of our wild trout resources. And so I think the hope is that's what this can do for anglers. Beyond that, I mean, it's going to be really important, I think, for prioritizing a lot of our actions, as an agency, but also, other organizations like Trout Unlimited, conservation commissions, watershed organizations, when we start to think about things like land acquisition. So a piece of property might come up for sale that borders a Class A stream. We might want to make a real effort to snap that up, for protecting that stream or for allowing access. If we look at conservation and restoration, we may want to focus our efforts, especially on things like restoration. We may want to be able to identify some of these lower tier streams, these Class D streams, or streams that are, that used to have wild fish and maybe don't anymore. We maybe want to pinpoint those for restoration efforts. Whereas for conservation, you can sort of have the conversation, do we want to, put our effort into conserving, some of the best streams and make sure those are the ones that stick around? Or do we want to put our effort into, conserving those that might sort of wink out, some of these lower tier streams? Internally, we can use this classification system to prioritize survey locations, some of the places where we don't have the data or we want updated data. And then, finally, we can use this for climate refugia work. So some of these streams, are Class A or premier for a reason. They have, ideal habitat. They have good water quality. They have cold water that might be, climate refugia as we move further and further into climate change and a warming climate. So being able to prioritize conserving these or pinpointing these is going to be important. So, I think that there's a lot of uses of this classification system, and I think it's going to be important from a number of different perspectives. And again, this is just one piece that we're going to start to roll out, hopefully soon after we finish some internal discussion on what it's finally going to look like. But this is one of the products that I see coming out at some point that's a part of, this sort of broader wild trout management plan that we've been developing. And we're going to sort of break up into pieces, one being this classification system, and provide to the conservation community and provide to, anglers and other groups to sort of, inform you and make it more of a, something that you guys can be participate in. So with that's all I've got for this today. I'm happy to answer questions and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Adam. We have a couple of questions. That was really a great presentation. And I see Scott and Matthew have some questions around the topic of catch and release and preservation and management. And, I'm assuming many of these streams are not stocked now. And would we try and keep them all natural and help guide the state? And hey, here's some rivers where you should throw stock fish in. Here's some, let's let them do their natural thing.
Yeah, so I mean, we don't really, it seems like we stock a lot of streams because for whatever reason, we promote, as an agency, we promote stocked trout a lot. And, I think that it's it really is a very small proportion of our 1,255 streams with wild trout. In any given year, we stock about 12 or 13% of those streams. Some of the big ones, like the Deerfield and the Swift and places like that, which are wild trout streams, they get stocked with fish. Most of our small wild trout streams don't get stocked. And, there's no desire to start stocking those. We've actually, over the years, particularly over the last 10 or 20 years, have continually cut down the number of streams that we've stocked. And I feel like that trend is gonna keep going.
It looks like more of the stocking is going to a lot of ponds, which helps a lot of kids get out there and go fishing, which works.
Sure, yeah.
What about the comment of two questions on sort of catch and release, or I have a thing to add to that. Would we, if it's a stream that's exceptional, but maybe we want to preserve it, would we have different bag limits?
Yeah, for sure. So that's one of the things that's really up for discussion at this point is, now that we have these streams, classified, and, what are we going to do with them? How are we going to manage them? And it's a pretty difficult question to answer because while we have a lot of biological data, and we don't have a lot of, creel data or, sort of human dimensions type data. So, it's all well and good to put regulations on these streams, but, without sort of understanding how anglers use the resource, we don't want to alienate folks unnecessarily. And we don't want to slap on regulations, if the vast majority of people are catch and release, and there's those few people that maybe want to go out and catch some fish and keep them that aren't really doing much harm. It's a difficult sort of balancing act when it comes to that. But certainly, it's something that we're in discussion on how we want to, use regulations to manage some of these fisheries going forward.
Thank you. Any other questions from folks? Verbally, you want to, Kevin, I see your hand is up. I missed that little.
First, Adam, thank you for a great presentation, and thank you for doing all the great work that you've done on the Deerfield and the interest that you've taken in this, because it's truly as a result of your Midwestern experience, bringing it to Massachusetts is making a big difference in the way that Mass Fish and Wildlife is approaching this. And I think we were really thankful when you were appointed our resident biologist for the Deerfield to do the study work that you've been doing over the last 3 years. And we know that the work that you've done is going to make an incredible difference for our area. And so, just as a homer, there are concerns from those who do live out here and those that do the work in conservation for our rivers and streams out here, and that, yeah, we're proud of it. We don't necessarily want to show you where the special holes, but on the other hand, we don't like gate slammers either. And so we take advantage of you folks in certain ways, and we do want to share with you. And so, but I do think that when we start talking about promoting something, that we also need to be thinking about the regulatory side and the management side, and specifically as far as on the Deerfield, as we move forward with that upper section, and who knows what's going to happen with regards to the rainbow study and the other work that Eric is leading the charge on. There are certain things that I think that the department needs to talk about and invite us in to talk about, I think. And that specifically is protecting those refuge areas in the Deerfield where there are colder trib coming into the Deerfield, and there's a stacking up of stocked fish and wild fish in those areas. Having those, like on the Housatonic, identify those refuge areas and protect them. I also think that given the what we've shown in the spawning study, as far as this very specific areas where the brown trout are primarily spawning, that there needs to be some regulation with respect to those areas as well, as far as no fishing areas. And I don't know if there's blue dog law regulations like some of the states have with regard to the temperature, and also as far as just shutting down a river for a month as far as fishing where the spawning is happening. And if we really want to enhance these wild rivers and these wild fisheries, particularly with the Deerfield, that's what I'm concerned about right now. that's something that we should be talking about and planning for. I also, just as a note, somebody had brought up the question as far as catch and release versus not. I think the jury's out on that, frankly, as far as whether or not catch and release makes a difference or not. And I'm inclined to say that if you have catch and release only, I don't know if you're really saving that many fish, to tell you the truth. And because of the type of people that are going to be coming to that area regardless. So, you start enforcing that, and already we have an enforcement problem. That's the other aspect that I want to bring up to you, and is, we people that are our members are calling upon the game wardens to come out and try to catch people that are poaching fish in catch and release only areas, and they won't show up because they're busy with other stuff, or they're not around, or it's just not really a priority. And that's another aspect of this, is that there has to be funding on the Commonwealth as far as enforcement of anything. If they want to promote these things, and if the idea is to drive revenue for licenses, well, then you got to put some backbone behind it, and that is regulation and also enforcement. So that's those are my comments. And again, Adam, I really appreciate everything that you've done for us. We're very thankful.
Well, thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. Open it up for anyone else that has a question.
It looks like Mike has a question.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Adam, thanks so much, and Rui and the board, thank you guys for putting this together. I love this kind of presentations, as someone who was just like walking in the woods this past weekend, and seeing all the red actions of all the native brook trout and the swift and whatnot. They're just so cool. They're so neat. Those are our resources that we have to protect, in my opinion. And I'm so happy to hear that the state is really taking this seriously, and you particularly, Adam, are taking it so seriously. So thank you for that. The first thing that I was struck with when I was listening to your presentation in the classification system specifically was how just classifying these streams presents such an amazing opportunity for education. Even something as simple as, and this is probably equal parts Trout Unlimited's responsibility and the local chapters as much as it would be the state, but what does a red look like on a class A native brook trout stream? How do you identify that? How do you avoid disrupting reproductive cycles in sensitive times of year? And I was wondering if you wanted to comment on if you guys had talked about that at all.
As in, like putting out information.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. It's something we talk about every year, but it's just a difficult, we're not really sure where to put that information. We have a whole department that deals with like social media and the press and things like that. And, we've never really come to a consensus on sort of the best way to put that forward. And then it's the next year, it seems like it comes up, but then, it just kind of gets passed down the line. But that is a good idea. And, it might be something that's like a Trout Unlimited thing, that maybe puts up signs or something like that. I'm not exactly sure how that would work, but, maybe we would even put it on our Facebook or Instagram, That's a good great point. That's a good point. It's something that we talk about briefly each year, and then kind of just, goes by the wayside.
Well, I'm happy to kind of, if that's something that the chapter decides to pursue, I would definitely be willing to help out with that.
Okay.
Well,
yeah.
We can talk later, Mike. Yeah, absolutely. We have a former board member that actually posted about 2 weeks or so, maybe 3 weeks ago, about watch out for the reds, and tagged us in that. So I think all of us as that are representing different chapters, get your social media team on it. But if it's just TU saying it, it's one thing. If all the chapters are saying it's even better. If our government agencies also get involved and post it, the more, the messaging is out there, whether it's, it's drought levels and we shouldn't be fishing, or whether the water's hot, give the fish a break, or, the reds are present and the fish are breeding, we can all do our part there and help protect and keep these as Class A type rivers or exceptional rivers and streams. Good point, Mike. Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Any other thoughts from folks? I think we have a couple minutes left for maybe one or two questions or. All right. So Adam, this was really a phenomenal presentation, and it gives me hope when I see a little, maybe it was a Class B stream in the greater Boston area, but we can't tell anyone who that
there's
is.
A couple. There's a couple.
Yep.
If you guys are, you had mentioned Trap Hole Brook, you know, that's really something. I mean, I'm very surprised every time I go there and survey like Trap Hole and Pine Tree and some of those other brooks. It's amazing that, you know, Boston's been basically developed for 400 years and there's still wild trout in the metro area.
Yeah, it is amazing. And I mean, obviously the Southeast has a couple there too, which is great. But for all of you that live in Western Massachusetts, you're in the lion's share of some phenomenal place. And that's why many of us drive 2 hours. And if we're too tired, we'll just go in the harbor and we'll get some stripers, which can always be fun too. So, you know, Adam, when you think about all the members we have on track here listening to you, if there's an opportunity for any members to volunteer or for our chapters to help you get volunteers when you're doing survey data, when you're doing electroshocking, think about, you know, reaching out to us. Hey, we're going to be in the Deerfield or the Greater Boston or Trap Hole or Swift, and we're looking for a couple of folks. Think about us as a resource, because we always get requests for, hey, can I volunteer and help with something? And that can always be exciting. I don't know if you're allowed to do that and get a volunteer to show up.
No, yeah, it's totally fine. We take volunteers, but yeah, we're sort of working on doing more and more sort of in the metro area, especially with some of these dam removals that are occurring or in the works. You know, we're going to be doing, you know, before and after surveys, and we've got, you know, several streams that we want to survey on more regular basis to sort of keep tabs on them. So certainly in the greater Boston metro area, we'll need of volunteers, and then, you know, there might be something coming on the up on the Swift. If we end up getting some funding that we've applied for, we may have several years of research project there that we could certainly, in some cases, use some help on.
All right, fantastic. So again, like Kevin said, and the rest of us, thank you so much for all the work that you and Mass Fish and Wildlife are doing. And I think the more that we team up and communicate and collaborate and share ideas, whether it's just more social media posts or getting waders on and getting in the water with you, these are, you know, all opportunities for us to help protect the waters that we have here. I think I just want to close out very quickly. So virtual, or I don't know if you do the raising hands thing, but thank you very much, Adam. This is really great.
Thank you, guys. Thanks.
And I think I'm just going to see if I can do one thing just to close out. So next month, we do not have a chapter meeting. We take a pause. So I hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving, or however you celebrate, and all the holidays that are coming up in December. And we will be launching a Giving Tuesday next Tuesday. And then we'll be at the Marlborough Fly Fishing Show. We have other events lined up. And please feel free to reach out to Adam if you have any questions. I think you can find him on the Mass Fish and Wildlife website or his last slide there. And if you have any questions for the board or myself, feel free to reach out, and all the rest of you enjoy the rest of the week.